The first sign of trouble came at dawn when the communication arrays went silent. Marcus Chen stood at his post outside the throne chamber, his withered hands gripping the plasma rifle that felt heavier with each passing year. 23 years of service to the Zilithian Empire had taught him to read the subtle signs of impending chaos, and today those signs screamed danger. The massive crystalline doors behind him hummed with their usual energy, protecting Empress Viroleth as she conducted her morning meditations. The sound had become as familiar to Marcus as his own heartbeat over the decades he'd served as her personal guard. What wasn't familiar was the eerie silence that had settled over the palace corridors like a suffocating blanket. Where were the other guards? The shift change should have happened 2 hours ago, but Marcus remained alone at his post. His communications device crackled with static when he tried to reach the guard commander, and the emergency frequencies returned only empty silence. Something was very, very wrong. Marcus had been the only human in the Zilithian Royal Guard for most of his career. When he first arrived on Zelith Prime as a young refugee from the human colony wars, he never imagined he'd spend his life protecting an alien monarchy. The Zilithians had taken him in when his own species had failed him, and Empress Viroleth had seen something in the desperate young human that others had missed. The Zilithians were a proud, ancient race of reptilian humanoids whose scales shifted color with their emotions and the light. They stood nearly 8 feet tall on average, with elongated skulls and forearms that made them formidable in combat. Their technology was centuries ahead of anything humanity had achieved, yet they valued honor and loyalty above all else. Marcus had proven both in abundance during his years of service. A distant explosion echoed through the palace walls, causing the crystal fixtures to chime softly. Marcus's grip tightened on his weapon as he activated his armor's scanning systems. The readings were troubling, multiple ships were approaching the palace, and they weren't broadcasting Imperial identification codes. The throne chamber doors suddenly blazed with light as Empress Viroleth emerged, her royal robes flowing around her massive frame. Her scales had shifted to a deep crimson, indicating high stress and anger. Her forearms moved with practiced grace as she secured her own weapons, and her golden eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him stand straighter. Marcus, her voice resonated with the harmonic undertones that all Zilithians possessed. Where are my other guards? Why do you stand alone? I don't know, Your Majesty, Marcus replied honestly, his own voice rough with decades of shouting orders and breathing alien atmosphere. Communications are down, and no one reported for duty change. I detected incoming ships with hostile intent. Viroletha's scales shifted to an even darker shade of red as she processed this information. In all her years as Empress, she had faced many threats to her rule, but never had her own guards simply vanished without explanation. The implications were staggering. Either her entire security force had been compromised, or something so terrible was approaching that they had fled in terror. Have you considered abandoning your post? She asked, studying Marcus's weathered face intently. Marcus actually smiled at the question, deep lines crinkling around his brown eyes. With respect, Your Majesty, I've been considering that question for about 30 seconds every day for the past 23 years. The answer remains the same. Another explosion, closer this time, sent vibrations through the floor. The palace's defensive systems began activating, energy shields flickering to life around critical areas, but Marcus could see from his display that many systems were already offline. Someone had prepared for this assault very thoroughly. The rebellion, Viroleth said, her voice carrying a note of resignation. Prince Zirith has finally made his move. Marcus nodded grimly. Prince Zirith was Viroletha's younger brother, a charismatic military leader who had been gathering support among the noble houses for years. He believed the empire had grown weak under his sister's rule, particularly her policies of tolerance toward other species and her refusal to expand through conquest. The fact that a human served as her personal guard was often cited as evidence of her weakness. Your Majesty, we need to evacuate you to the bunkers, Marcus said, checking his weapon's charge level. The palace defenses won't hold against a coordinated assault. No, Viroleth replied firmly, all 4 of her arms crossing in a gesture of absolute determination. I will not cower in a hole while my brother destroys everything I have built. If this is to be my end, I will face it on my throne. Marcus had served the Empress long enough to recognize when argument was futile. Viroleth possessed the stubborn pride that had made the Zilithian Empire great, but it was also the trait that would likely get them both killed today. Still, he had sworn an oath, and that oath hadn't included any clauses about reasonable chances of survival. Then, we make our stand here, Marcus said, moving to barricade the entrance to the throne chamber. But I suggest we prepare for a siege, Your Majesty." As if responding to his words, the sound of marching feet echoed from the main corridor. Marcus's scanner indicated at least 50 soldiers approaching, their armor signatures matching Imperial forces. Zirith had indeed turned the guard, probably through a combination of bribes, threats, and appeals to Zilithian supremacy. Marcus activated the throne chamber's defensive protocols, energy barriers rising across the entrance while weapon systems emerged from hidden panels. The room had been designed to withstand assault, but it hadn't been designed to operate with only one guard manning the defenses. Viroleth, a booming voice called from beyond the barriers, amplified by military speakers. "Sister, you have led our people astray for long enough. Surrender now, and I will grant you exile instead of execution." The Empress moved to her throne, a magnificent crystal structure that rose from the center of the chamber like a frozen flame. As she settled onto it, her scales shifted to deep purple, the color of royal determination. When she spoke, her voice carried the full authority of her bloodline. "Zirith, you treacherous fool. You think the Empire will prosper through fear and hatred? You think strength comes from crushing the weak rather than protecting them? I think," Zirith's voice replied, "that our empire dies a slow death while you play protector to lesser species. But your pet human proves my point perfectly. Where are your guards, sister? Where are the Zilithians who swore to die for you?" Marcus felt the sting of those words, not because they hurt him, but because they contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. He was the only one who had stayed. Every Zilithian guard had either been bought, frightened away, or simply decided that their loyalty had limits. Only the human remained. The first assault came moments later. Energy bolts hammered against the barriers while Marcus returned fire through designated ports. His human reflexes, honed by decades of combat, allowed him to target with precision that surprised even him. 3 attackers fell before they could take cover, and the assault paused. "Impressive, human," Zirith's voice carried grudging respect. "But you cannot hold forever. My offer extends to you as well. Join me, and I will grant you a position in my new order." Marcus's response was another precisely aimed shot that destroyed one of Zirith's mobile speakers. The message was clear enough. The siege settled into a rhythm of attack and defense. Marcus moved constantly around the chamber, using different weapon emplacements to prevent the attackers from predicting his position. His human endurance, while inferior to Zilithian strength, allowed him to maintain consistent accuracy over long periods. The energy barriers held, but Marcus could see their power levels dropping steadily. Empress Viroleth remained on her throne throughout the battle, occasionally calling out tactical advice but mostly watching her human guard with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Her scales had shifted through several colors during the fight: purple determination, gold for pride, and occasionally flashes of deep blue that indicated profound sadness. Hours passed. Marcus's armor recycling systems kept him hydrated and fed, but fatigue was beginning to take its toll. His hands cramped from gripping weapons, and his eyes burned from staring at targeting displays. Still, he held the line, because that's what humans did. They endured. "Marcus," Viroleth called during a brief lull in the fighting. "Why? Why do you remain when others fled?" Marcus paused in reloading his rifle to consider the question seriously. "Your Majesty, with respect, I think you're asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "The question isn't why I stayed. The question is why anyone thought I might leave." Viroleth's scales shifted to a warm gold color that Marcus had learned to associate with genuine affection and respect. In all his years of service, he had never seen her display that particular shade except when looking at him. The attacks resumed with renewed intensity. Prince Zirith had apparently grown tired of the siege and was committing more resources to breaking through. Marcus could see heavy siege equipment being moved into position outside the chamber, weapons capable of overloading the barriers through sheer destructive force. "Your Majesty," Marcus said quietly, not taking his eyes off his scanner readouts, "if I may suggest something tactical?" "Of course. Your brother expects you to behave like a Zilithian noble. He's prepared for pride, defiance, and last stands. He's not prepared for human unpredictability." Viroleth's head tilted in the curious gesture he'd seen thousands of times over the years. "What do you have in mind?" Marcus smiled, the expression grim but determined. "We're going to do something that will either save us both or get us killed more creatively than simply sitting here waiting." The first phase of Marcus's plan was simple misdirection. He began rotating through the weapon systems faster, creating the illusion that multiple defenders were manning the barriers. His shots came from different angles in rapid succession, suggesting coordination between several guards. It was a trick he'd learned during the colony wars: make the enemy think you have more resources than you actually possess. The deception worked for nearly an hour, causing Ziritha's forces to hold back their heavy assault while they tried to assess the actual defensive strength. During this time, Marcus was implementing the second phase of his plan, one that required skills he'd learned long before becoming a royal guard. Before the colony wars, before his exile and refuge among the Zilithians, Marcus had been an engineer. Specifically, he'd specialized in power systems and energy distribution. The throne chamber's defensive network was incredibly sophisticated, but it followed the same basic principles as any electrical system. And Marcus knew how to overload electrical systems. Working with quiet efficiency while maintaining defensive fire, Marcus began rerouting power from non-essential systems throughout the palace. Environmental controls, lighting, communications, recreational facilities, everything that wouldn't immediately compromise their position was redirected to charge the throne chamber's barriers beyond their normal capacity. The work was dangerous. Zilithian technology operated at energy levels that could kill a human instantly if mishandled, and Marcus was essentially hot-wiring a system designed by beings with 4 arms and electromagnetic perception. But his decades of working with alien technology had given him insights that most humans lacked. Marcus, as Viroleth said, noticing the increasing brightness of the energy barriers, "What are you doing?" "Something stupid that might work," Marcus replied, sweat beading on his forehead as he made delicate adjustments to power relays. "Or something clever that will definitely kill us. I'll let you know which in about 10 minutes. Outside the chamber, Prince Ziritha's forces were positioning their siege weapons for what would certainly be the final assault. Marcus could see heavy plasma cannons and barrier disruptors being aimed at their position. Once those weapons fired, no amount of power rerouting would save them. But Marcus wasn't planning to outlast the siege weapons. He was planning to make them irrelevant. The third phase of his plan required perfect timing and a level of trust between species that Prince Zirith would never understand. Marcus turned to Empress Viroleth, his weathered face serious. "Your Majesty, in about 60 seconds, I'm going to need you to do something that will feel very wrong to every instinct you have as a Zilithian." "What?" "I'm going to need you to run." Viroletha's scales shifted rapidly through several colors before settling on deep red indignation. "I will not flee like a coward while you sacrifice yourself." "Not flee," Marcus clarified, his hands moving steadily across the power controls. "Attack. But, in a very un-Zilithian way," he explained quickly while monitoring the approaching siege weapons. The plan was insane, relying on human tactics that prioritized surprise and adaptability over honor and direct confrontation. It would require Viroleth to abandon everything she'd been taught about proper royal behavior. "Will it work?" she asked. Marcus checked his power readings one final time. The barriers were now charged to nearly 300% of their design capacity, and warning indicators were flashing throughout the chamber. "Honestly? Probably not. But it's better than waiting here to die with dignity." The siege weapons powered up with a whine that Marcus could feel in his bones. This was it, the moment when Prince Zirith would end his sister's reign and reshape the Zilithian Empire according to his vision. The moment when the last human guard would fall defending an alien throne. Except Marcus Chen had never been particularly good at doing what was expected of him. "On my mark, Your Majesty," he said, his hand hovering over the final power relay. 3, 2, 1, mark. Marcus slammed the relay home, and the throne chamber's barriers didn't just overload, they exploded outward in a directed blast of pure energy that tore through the palace walls like paper. The siege weapons, the attacking soldiers, and a significant portion of the corridor beyond simply ceased to exist in a flash of light that could be seen from orbit. In the sudden silence that followed, as emergency lighting flickered and debris settled, Empress Viroleth stared at her human guard with something approaching awe. "Marcus," she said slowly, "that was either brilliant or insane." "Why not both?" Marcus replied, checking his rifle's charge level. "But we're not done yet. Phase 4 starts now." Because while the explosion had eliminated the immediate threat, Marcus knew that Prince Zirith himself would not have been caught in the blast. The real battle was just beginning. Marcus's vacation lasted exactly 18 hours. He had barely finished his first real meal in days when the emergency beacon started screaming from his quarters communication panel. The sound was one he'd heard only twice before in his career, both times when the Empire faced extinction-level threats. This was not the kind of alarm that got triggered by political unrest or normal military conflicts. Throwing on his armor, Marcus raced through the palace corridors toward the Imperial Command Center. The damage from yesterday's battle was still visible everywhere: scorch marks on walls, work crews replacing shattered crystal fixtures, and nervous servants who jumped at unexpected sounds. But there was something else wrong, something that made Marcus's trained instincts scream warnings. The palace was too quiet. Again. When Marcus burst into the command center, he found Empress Viroleth standing before a massive holographic display showing the outer reaches of the Zilithian star system. Her scales were cycling rapidly through colors: deep red for anger, blue for fear, purple for determination, and occasionally flashing white for pure terror. Prince Xerath stood beside her, his own scales locked in the black of barely controlled rage. Marcus's Viroleth said without turning around, "Thank the ancestors you're here. We have a situation." The holographic display showed what appeared to be a fleet of ships approaching the system, but Marcus had never seen vessels like these before. They were massive, some easily dwarfing Imperial battleships, and their configuration was completely alien. Not just non-Zilithian alien, but genuinely unknown in design and technology. "Who are they?" Marcus asked, studying the sensor readings. "That," Prince Xerath said grimly, "is what we're trying to determine. They appeared at the system's edge 3 hours ago. No response to communication attempts, no identification signals, and their technology doesn't match anything in our databases." Marcus frowned at the display. "How many ships?" 47 confirmed, with more arriving every few minutes, the Empress replied. "Our long-range sensors suggest they're part of a much larger fleet." "Invasion force?" "Unknown. They're not moving toward inhabited worlds yet, but they're positioned to blockade all major travel routes in and out of the system." Marcus studied the tactical situation while his mind processed the implications. An unknown fleet of this size didn't just appear randomly. Someone had sent them, and their positioning suggested they understood Zilithian military doctrine well enough to know exactly where to place their ships for maximum strategic effect. "Your Majesty," Marcus said slowly, "what happened to our missing guards? Did we ever figure that out?" Viroleth and Xerath exchanged glances that told Marcus more than their words did. The investigation revealed troubling information, the Empress admitted. "How troubling?" "They weren't bought, threatened, or even killed," Xerath explained. "They were evacuated. Someone with Imperial authorization codes ordered them to emergency positions throughout the system. Positions that, we now realize, would have put them directly in the path of this approaching fleet." Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. Someone inside the Imperial government knew this attack was coming. Worse, Viroleth said, her scales shifting to deep blue. Someone with very high-level access sent our best guards directly into harm's way. Either to eliminate them as potential defenders, or to deliver them to whoever's coming, Marcus finished, his tactical mind reaching the same horrible conclusion. This isn't a random invasion. It's a coordinated betrayal. The implications were staggering. Someone within the Zilithian government had not only known about the approaching threat but had actively worked to weaken the Empire's defenses. The timing of Prince Xerath's rebellion suddenly seemed far too convenient. It had eliminated or scattered most of the palace guard just hours before an alien fleet arrived. "There's more," Prince Xerath said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "We've been analyzing the communication protocols these ships are using. They're encrypted, but some of the base frequencies match Imperial military channels." "Someone's been sharing our communications technology," Viroleth added. "Possibly for years." Marcus walked closer to the holographic display, studying the alien vessels with growing unease. Their design was completely unknown, but their tactical formation was disturbingly familiar. They were positioned exactly where Zilithian doctrine would place them for a systematic conquest of the system. "Have they made any demands?" he asked. "None," Viroleth replied. "They're just waiting." "For what?" That question was answered minutes later when a new ship appeared on the long-range sensors. This vessel was different from the others, smaller, more elegant, and broadcasting Imperial identification codes. As they watched, it moved through the alien fleet without challenge and headed directly for Zenith Prime. "I recognize that ship signature," Prince Xerath said slowly. "That's the Crimson Dawn, flagship of Admiral Corvash.
Marcus knew the name, though he had never met the admiral personally.
Corvash was one of the Empire's most senior military commanders, a veteran of the border wars who commanded tremendous respect throughout the fleet. He was also, Marcus recalled, one of the few Zilithian nobles who had openly criticized Empress Viroletha's policies regarding alien species. "He's requesting immediate landing clearance and a private audience with Your Majesty," the communications officer reported.
"Denied," Viroleth said immediately. "All vessels are to maintain standard distance until this situation is resolved."
"Your Majesty," the officer said nervously, "Admiral Corvash is transmitting override codes."
Imperial Emergency Protocol 7.
Marcus saw Viroletha's scales go white with shock. Protocol 7 could only be invoked in cases of imminent existential threat to the Empire, and it granted the invoking officer temporary command authority over all Imperial forces.
"He's staging a military coup," Prince Zirith snarled.
"Not exactly," a new voice said from the command center's entrance.
"He's staging an intervention."
Marcus spun around to see a figure he didn't recognize, a tall, thin alien with blue-gray skin and large, multifaceted eyes. The creature wore what appeared to be diplomatic robes, but Marcus's experience told him the being was also carrying concealed weapons.
"Who are you?"
Marcus demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "I am Ambassador Zenth of the Hegemony," the alien replied calmly.
"And I am here to offer Empress Viroletha choice." The Hegemony.
Marcus had heard rumors of that organization during his military service, whispers of a vast interstellar coalition that existed beyond the borders of known space. Most intelligence agencies considered it either myth or exaggeration, but apparently they were wrong.
"How did you get into my command center?"
Viroleth demanded, her forearms reaching for her weapons.
"Admiral Corvash provided access," Ambassador Zenth replied.
"Along with detailed information about your palace's defenses, your guard rotations, and your personal habits. He has been quite cooperative."
The betrayal was complete then.
Admiral Corvash hadn't just compromised the fleet, he had been feeding intelligence to an enemy organization for months or possibly years. The rebellion, the missing guards, the alien fleet, it had all been orchestrated to bring them to this moment.
"What do you want?" Marcus asked bluntly. Ambassador Zentha's large eyes focused on him with what might have been curiosity. "Ah, the famous human. We have heard interesting reports about your recent actions. Your species is unexpected in its capabilities. Answer the question." "The Hegemony offers the Zilithian Empire a choice," Zenth continued, apparently unbothered by Marcus's hostile tone.
"Join us willingly and maintain significant autonomy under our protection, or be absorbed forcibly with much less favorable terms."
"And if we refuse both options?" Prince Zirith asked. Zenth gestured toward the holographic display showing the alien fleet.
"Then, you will discover why 17 other galactic civilizations have already chosen to join the Hegemony rather than face our full military capacity."
Marcus studied the alien diplomat while his mind raced through possibilities.
The Hegemony's approach was sophisticated, they had compromised key Imperial officials, timed their arrival to coincide with internal strife, and positioned their forces to make resistance appear hopeless. It was exactly the kind of strategy that worked against most species. But Marcus wasn't most species.
"Ambassador," Marcus said politely, "may I ask you a question?" Zentha's multifaceted eyes shifted to focus on him again. "Certainly. In all your research on the Zilithian Empire, how much time did your people spend studying humans?" The question seemed to puzzle the ambassador. "Humans?
You are peripheral to our interests. A minor species with limited technological development and no significant military assets."
"I see," Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I thought you'd say."
Before anyone could react, Marcus was moving. His plasma rifle came up smoothly, targeting not the ambassador but the concealed weapon Marcus had detected earlier. The shot was precisely calibrated, enough power to destroy the weapon without seriously injuring the being carrying it.
Ambassador Zenth stumbled backward in shock, his diplomatic composure finally cracking as he realized he was suddenly unarmed and surrounded by very angry Zilithians.
"You see," Marcus explained calmly, keeping his rifle trained on the alien, "that's the problem with being a vast interstellar coalition.
You get used to dealing with civilizations that behave predictably.
You research their governments, compromise their leaders, position your forces optimally, and then make reasonable offers that reasonable people accept.
Marcus smiled, an expression that made Zenth take another step backward. But humans aren't particularly reasonable.
We tend to do things that don't make tactical sense, like staying at our posts when everyone else runs away, or fighting impossible battles because someone needs to stand up and say no. Empress Viroleth was beginning to understand where Marcus was going with this. Her scales shifted to a warm gold that indicated both pride and anticipation. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "I'm suggesting," Marcus said, "that the ambassador's bosses have made the same mistake that everyone makes about humans. They've assumed that being small and weak means being irrelevant." "You cannot seriously be considering armed resistance," Zenth protested. "Your forces are outnumbered 50 to 1. Your own admiral has betrayed you. Resistance is futile." "Probably," Marcus agreed cheerfully. "But I've got a question for you, Ambassador. In all your vast hegemony's conquests, how many of those 17 civilizations actually fought back?" Zentha's silence was answer enough. "Right," Marcus continued. "They all saw your overwhelming force, calculated the odds, and made the reasonable decision to surrender. But here's the thing about humans, we're not always reasonable. Sometimes we fight impossible battles just because they need fighting." Marcus turned to address Empress Viroleth directly. "Your Majesty, I can't tell you what decision to make for your empire. But I can tell you what I'd do if someone showed up at my home and demanded I submit or die." "And what would you do?" Marcus's smile was grim but determined. "I'd make them prove they could make me." The command center fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Ambassador Zenth was clearly trying to understand how a single human could so completely derail what should have been a simple diplomatic coup. Prince Zirith was staring at Marcus with the same expression he'd worn during their duel, confusion mixed with growing respect. "You're suggesting we fight a war we cannot win," Viroleth said slowly. "I'm suggesting we fight a war they don't expect," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference. Even if we could somehow defeat their fleet," Prince Zirith pointed out, "Admiral Korvash still controls significant Imperial forces. We'd be fighting on two fronts." "Actually," Marcus said, checking his rifle's power level, "I think I have a solution for Admiral Korvash." He looked at Ambassador Zenth, who was still trying to process how his careful diplomatic mission had turned into a hostage situation. "Ambassador, you're going to help us send a message to your fleet." "I will not." "Yes, you will," Marcus interrupted. "Because you're going to realize that humans have another trait your bosses probably didn't research thoroughly." "What?" "We're very good at making things explode." Marcus gestured toward the holographic display, where the alien fleet continued its patient blockade. "Those ships of yours are powerful, but they're positioned for intimidation, not combat. Your commanders are thinking like diplomats, not warriors. They're assuming this will be settled through negotiation. Because that is how civilized species conduct business," Zenth replied stiffly. "Right," Marcus nodded. "Civilized species. But I'm not from a civilized species. I'm from a species that had to fight for everything we ever got, including the right to exist." Marcus walked over to the command console and began entering targeting data with rapid efficiency. "I'm from a species that learned a long time ago that sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to punch them in the face hard enough to make them reconsider their life choices." "What are you doing?" Viroleth asked. "I'm calculating firing solutions for the palace defense batteries," Marcus replied. "Those weapons were designed to defend against conventional attacks using known technologies." "But I'm betting your hegemony friends don't know enough about human engineering principles to expect what I'm planning." Ambassador Zenth was beginning to look genuinely concerned. "You cannot seriously intend to attack our fleet with planetary defense weapons. The range differential alone makes it impossible," Marcus agreed. "Using conventional targeting and standard power settings. But I've never been particularly interested in doing things conventionally." Marcus's fingers danced across the control interface, implementing modifications that would have seemed insane to anyone who hadn't spent decades working with human-influenced technology. He was essentially turning the palace defense grid into a massive, planet-spanning railgun by linking all the individual batteries and overcharging them beyond their safety specifications. "Marcus," Prince Zirith said slowly, "that could overload the entire planetary power grid." "It probably will," Marcus confirmed. "But it might also put a hole through one of their capital ships. And once we prove we can hurt them, this stops being a diplomatic annexation and becomes a real war." A war we cannot win, Zenth insisted. Marcus looked up from the controls, his weathered face showing the same determined calm that had sustained him through 23 years of service.
Ambassador, he said quietly, you keep using that word. But, I don't think you understand what it means to a human. For us, the question was never whether we could win.
The question was whether the fight was worth having. He gestured around the command center, at Empress Viroleth and Prince Zirith, at the loyal officers who had not fled or betrayed their oaths.
These people gave me a home when I had nothing.
They gave me a purpose when my own species had abandoned me. They treated me with honor and respect when I had no right to expect either.
So yes, Ambassador, this fight is worth having.
Marcus returned to his calculations, making final adjustments to what was probably the most insane military strategy in galactic history. Even if we lose, even if your hegemony eventually conquers the system, you're going to learn something important about humans. You're going to learn why 17 civilizations surrendered to you, but at least one refused. You're going to learn the difference between being defeated and being conquered.
The targeting solution was complete. One shot, precisely calibrated, using every defense battery on the planet firing in perfect synchronization. If it worked, they would announce to the galaxy that the Zilithian Empire intended to fight. If it failed, they would probably die in the resulting power overload. Marcus looked at Empress Viroleth, waiting for her decision. Your Majesty, he asked.
Viroleth studied the tactical display for a long moment, her scales shifting through several colors as she weighed impossible choices. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the full authority of her bloodline. Ambassador Zenth, please transmit the following message to your fleet commander. The Zilithian Empire declines your generous offer.
We suggest you withdraw to a safe distance and reconsider your approach. Zenth stared at her in disbelief. You cannot be serious. You are choosing extinction over submission.
No, Viroleth replied, moving to stand beside Marcus at the firing controls. We are choosing to remain who we are, regardless of the consequences.
Fire the guns, Marcus. Marcus smiled as he engaged the firing sequence. Gladly, Your Majesty.
The palace defense batteries fired as one, sending a coherent stream of energy across millions of kilometers of space at a significant percentage of light speed. The shot was mathematically perfect, striking the hegemony flagship exactly where Marcus had calculated it would be when the beam arrived. The alien vessel simply disappeared in a flash of light that could be seen with the naked eye from the planet's surface. In the stunned silence that followed, Ambassador Zenth stared at the tactical display with something approaching terror.
Impossible, he whispered. Planetary defense weapons cannot achieve those ranges. Human planetary defense weapons can't, Marcus agreed. But, Zilithian weapons modified using human engineering principles apparently can. Who knew?
The alien fleet was suddenly moving, abandoning their static positions as they realized they were within range of weapons they hadn't thought capable of threatening them. Their perfect diplomatic positioning had become a tactical nightmare.
I believe, Empress Viroleth said calmly, that Admiral Korvash will want to reconsider his allegiances very quickly. Ambassador, would you be so kind as to inform your fleet that any attempt to approach this planet will result in additional demonstrations of our defensive capabilities?
Marcus was already calculating firing solutions for the next volley as the political and military situation shifted rapidly around them. The hegemony had made the mistake that so many others had made over the years. They had underestimated what humans could accomplish when they had something worth protecting. But the war was just beginning, and Marcus knew that their single successful shot had only bought them time. The real battle would start when the hegemony stopped thinking of this as a diplomatic mission and started treating it as a military campaign. Still, for now, they had sent a clear message to the galaxy: the Zilithian Empire would not surrender, and anyone who wanted to conquer them would have to fight for it. The hegemony's response came exactly 6 hours later, and it was not what Marcus had expected. Instead of the massive retaliation he'd prepared for, a single small ship approached Zelith Prime under a flag of diplomatic immunity. The vessel was escorted by 3 Zilithian destroyers, Admiral Korvash's ships, returning to Imperial control after their commander had apparently reconsidered his position following the destruction of the hegemony flagship. Marcus stood in the palace's main landing bay, watching the diplomatic shuttle settle onto the polished floor with mechanical precision. Behind him, a full honor guard of newly recruited palace guards, volunteers from the Imperial Army who had stepped forward when word of the human stand spread through the ranks, stood ready for whatever this meeting might bring. Empress Viroleth and Prince Zirith flanked him, their ceremonial armor polished to mirror brightness but their weapons very functional. The past 6 hours had brought a flood of communications from across the Empire as news of their resistance spread. Some systems pledged support, others demanded surrender, and a few seemed to be waiting to see which way the wind would blow. But the most surprising development had been the stream of volunteers arriving at the palace. Not just Zilithians, but representatives from every species within the Empire. Apparently, Marcus's decision to stand and fight had resonated with more beings than anyone had anticipated. The shuttle's ramp lowered with a soft hiss, and Ambassador Zenth emerged, followed by a figure that made Marcus's hand instinctively move toward his weapon. The being was clearly hegemony, but unlike any species Marcus had seen before. It stood nearly 10 feet tall, with crystalline skin that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal, and eyes that glowed with their own internal light. "I am Overlord Kethrix," the being announced, its voice carrying harmonic overtones that seemed to resonate through the landing bay itself. "I come to speak with the human who has caused such complications." Marcus stepped forward, noting that the being's attention was focused entirely on him rather than on the actual rulers of the Empire.
"I'm Marcus Chen. I assume you want to discuss terms for our surrender?"
Kethrix studied him with those glowing eyes, and Marcus had the uncomfortable sensation that the being was seeing far more than just his physical appearance.
"Actually, I wish to offer you employment." The statement was so unexpected that even Marcus was caught off guard. "Come again?" "Your tactical innovations have impressed certain members of the hegemony leadership," Kethrix explained. "Your ability to maximize limited resources and achieve impossible results is valuable. We offer you a position as a strategic consultant, with considerable authority and compensation." Empress Viroleth's scales shifted to deep red indignation. "You attempt to buy my guard after failing to intimidate him?" "We attempt," Kethrix replied, "to avoid unnecessary casualties. Your human has demonstrated that this conquest will be far more expensive than our initial analysis suggested. It would be more efficient to recruit him than to fight him." Marcus looked at the towering alien overlord, then at Ambassador Zenth, who was watching the proceedings with obvious nervousness. The offer was actually quite clever: remove the tactical wildcard from the equation and the Zilithian Empire would fall back into predictable patterns of behavior. "That's a generous offer," Marcus said thoughtfully. "But I have a few questions." "Ask them." "First, what happens to the Zilithian Empire if I accept?" Kethrix's crystalline features shifted in what might have been a smile. "Standard integration protocols. The existing government structure remains in place but operates under hegemony oversight. Most citizens experience very little change in their daily lives. And those who resist integration are educated about the benefits of cooperation." Marcus nodded slowly. "I see. And this education process, does it involve the kind of weapons your flagship was carrying when I destroyed it?" For the first time, Kethrix showed something that might have been irritation. "When necessary, yes." "Right," Marcus said. "Second question, in your 17 previous conquests, how many species have maintained their original government structures after integration?" The pause before Kethrix answered told Marcus everything he needed to know. Government structures evolve to meet changing circumstances. "That's not an answer," Marcus pointed out. "But I'll accept it as confirmation that the answer is 0. Marcus walked closer to the towering overlord, craning his neck to look up at those glowing eyes. "Third question, do you really think I'm stupid enough to believe that joining you would protect these people?" Kethrix's crystalline skin darkened slightly. "I think you are intelligent enough to recognize reality. Your planet's defenses succeeded through surprise and innovation, but surprise can only be used once. We now understand your capabilities and can adjust accordingly." "True," Marcus agreed. "But you're still making the same mistake everyone makes about humans." "Which is?" "You think we calculate odds before we act. You think we weigh costs and benefits and make rational decisions based on likely outcomes." Marcus gestured around the landing bay at the mixed group of volunteers from dozens of different species who had come to stand with the Empire. "But humans don't fight because we think we can win. We fight because some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. And, apparently, we're not the only species that feels that way." Over the past 6 hours, representatives from across the galaxy had been arriving on Zenith Prime.
Not government officials or military leaders, but ordinary beings who had heard about the human guard who refused to abandon his post and decided they wanted to be part of that story. Most of them had no military training and limited combat value, but their presence sent a clear message: the hegemony's reputation for inevitable victory was starting to crack. You cannot seriously believe that sentiment can overcome superior firepower, Kethrix said dismissively.
Can't I? Marcus replied.
Tell me, Overlord, in your 17 conquests, did any of them involve prolonged ground combat?
Another pause. Ground operations were rarely necessary.
Most civilizations recognize the futility of resistance once orbital superiority is established. Right, because they fought like civilized species with something to lose. They calculated that preserving their populations was more important than preserving their independence. Marcus's smile was grim but determined. But I'm not from a civilized species. I'm from a species that spent most of its history fighting wars where surrender meant extinction anyway. We learned a long time ago that sometimes you fight not because you can win, but because losing on your feet is better than dying on your knees.
Prince Xerath stepped forward, his scales showing the deep purple of royal determination.
The human speaks for all of us, Overlord. The Zilithian Empire chooses to stand. As do we, added a new voice from the landing bay entrance. Marcus turned to see Captain Franks of the Vorthan Republic, a species known for their pacifist philosophy. Behind him came representatives from a dozen other civilizations, all of whom had apparently decided that this was where they wanted to make their stand. Kethrix looked around the growing assembly with what Marcus suspected was the first genuine surprise the being had experienced in centuries.
This is unprecedented.
This is what you get, Marcus said, when you threaten people who have something worth protecting and give them time to think about it. You've created exactly the kind of situation that humans specialize in, an impossible fight that someone needs to have. Marcus walked over to a wall display and activated the tactical overview. The screen showed the current positions of hegemony forces, imperial fleets, and the various ships that had arrived carrying volunteers from across the galaxy. Here's what's going to happen, Overlord, Marcus continued. You're going to go back to your fleet and explain to your leadership that this isn't going to be conquest number 18. This is going to be the first real war the hegemony has fought in centuries.
And you believe you can win such a war?
I believe, Marcus said carefully, that by the time we're done fighting it, your hegemony is going to understand why most species choose cooperation over conquest. You're going to learn the difference between ruling through fear and leading through respect.
Kethrix's glowing eyes narrowed.
You speak of costs, human.
Are you prepared to accept responsibility for the billions who will die in this unnecessary war?
It was a clever psychological attack, but Marcus had spent too many years carrying the weight of difficult decisions to be swayed by guilt tactics.
Are you prepared to accept responsibility for starting it?
We offer order, stability, and prosperity. You offer slavery with comfortable chains, Marcus interrupted. And you're apparently surprised that some species prefer dangerous freedom to comfortable servitude. Marcus gestured to Empress Viraleth, who nodded and stepped forward to address the hegemony overlord directly. Overlord Kethrix, she said, her voice carrying the full authority of her bloodline, the Zilithian Empire hereby formally rejects the hegemony's terms. We choose independence, with all the risks and responsibilities that choice entails. And we stand with them, Captain Franks added, speaking for the assembled representatives. Kethrix stared at the growing coalition for a long moment, his crystalline features cycling through colors that might have indicated deep thought or profound confusion. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been respect.
Very well. You have chosen war.
But understand that the hegemony has resources beyond your comprehension.
This resistance will be crushed, regardless of its moral righteousness. Probably, Marcus agreed. But, you know what? I think you're going to discover that crushing us is a lot more expensive than you calculated.
And I think some of your other subjects are going to start wondering if maybe they made the wrong choice when they surrendered. It was a calculated gamble, but Marcus could see from Kethrix's reaction that he had struck home. The hegemony's power was built partly on superior technology and partly on the perception of inevitable victory. Every prolonged conflict, every costly battle, every planet that chose to fight rather than submit weakened that perception.
This conversation is concluded, Kethrix announced. You have 3 standard days to reconsider your position before we begin military operations.
We don't need 3 days, Marcus replied.
We don't need 3 minutes. The answer is no, and it's going to stay no.
As the hegemony representatives returned to their shuttle, Marcus found himself surrounded by beings from dozens of different species, all of whom seemed to be looking to him for leadership in the impossible war they had just chosen to fight.
So, Prince Zirith said quietly, "What now, strategist?"
Marcus looked around at the assembled volunteers, mentally calculating their strengths, weaknesses, and potential contributions to the defense effort. It was an impossible situation by any conventional military standard, but Marcus had never been particularly conventional. "Now," he said, "we do what humans do best. We improvise, we adapt, and we make them work for every meter of space they take from us."
Against superior numbers, superior technology, and centuries of military experience?
Marcus smiled, feeling more like his old self than he had in years.
"Prince Zirith, have you ever studied human military history?" "Not extensively."
"Then, let me teach you something my species learned a long time ago. There's no such thing as impossible odds when you're fighting for your home.
There are just odds that require more creativity to overcome."
Marcus activated the command interface and began pulling up strategic data on hegemony forces, imperial defenses, and the various ships that had arrived with volunteers. The tactical situation was indeed hopeless by conventional standards, but Marcus had spent his entire career turning hopeless situations into manageable ones.
"First thing we need to do," he said, "is stop thinking like the civilized species the hegemony has conquered before.
They expect us to defend strategic positions, protect population centers, and minimize casualties.
And, instead?
Instead, we make them chase us through every system in the Empire while we gradually teach them that conquering territory is easy, but holding it against people who refuse to stay conquered is nearly impossible." Marcus began marking locations on the tactical display, not major population centers or strategic installations, but the kind of places where small, mobile forces could strike at hegemony supply lines and, then, disappear before retaliation could be organized.
"We're going to fight a human war," he continued.
"Hit and run, sabotage, turning their own size and complexity against them. We're going to make this conquest so expensive and time-consuming that other hegemony subjects start wondering if they're on the right side."
Empress Viroleth studied the emerging battle plan with growing understanding.
"You're not trying to defeat them militarily.
You're trying to defeat them politically."
"Exactly," Marcus confirmed.
"The hegemony's power depends on the perception that resistance is futile.
Every day we keep fighting, every small victory we achieve, every cost we impose on their operations weakens that perception."
"And if we fail?"
Marcus looked around at the assembled volunteers, seeing in their faces the same determination that had kept him at his post when everyone else fled. These beings had chosen to stand with the Empire not because they calculated they could win, but because some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. "If we fail," he said, "we fail while remaining who we are. And we make sure that when other species face the same choice in the future, they remember that someone stood up and said no." Marcus turned back to the tactical display and began the complex work of turning an impossible situation into merely an extremely difficult one. It would require everything he had learned about both human and Zilithian military doctrine, plus innovations that neither species had ever attempted before. But, for the first time since the crisis began, Marcusjan felt genuinely optimistic about their chances. Not because he thought they could win in any conventional sense, but because he understood something about humans that the hegemony had yet to learn. Sometimes the impossible happens simply because someone was stubborn enough to keep trying until it did. The war was about to begin, and Marcus intended to teach the galaxy what it really meant when someone decided to fight like a human. 2 years later, Marcusjan stood in the ruins of what had once been the hegemony's primary staging base in the Outer Rim, watching smoke rise from the twisted remains of their supply depot. Around him, a mixed force of Zilithian regulars, volunteer militia from a dozen species, and refugee engineers who had learned to turn civilian equipment into weapons were systematically dismantling everything that might be useful to their enemies. The war had not gone as anyone expected. Marcus had predicted that the conflict would be longer and more expensive than the hegemony calculated, but even he hadn't anticipated how completely their unconventional tactics would disrupt the enemy's strategic planning. What was supposed to have been a simple mop-up operation after the conquest of the Zilithian Empire had turned into a galactic-scale insurgency that was spreading to systems the hegemony had conquered decades earlier. "Marcus," came the voice of Captain Franks over the communication system, "we've finished loading the supplies.
Are you ready for extraction?"
Marcus took one last look around the devastated base, noting with satisfaction that it would take the hegemony months to rebuild their logistical capabilities in this sector. The raid had been a complete success, destroying enough military equipment to supply several worlds and capturing intelligence data that would allow them to anticipate hegemony movements for weeks to come. "Ready," Marcus replied, jogging toward the extraction point where a captured hegemony transport waited with engines running.
"Let's go home."
The journey back to their current base took 6 hours through hyperspace routes that hadn't existed on any official charts 2 years ago. The network of hidden paths and secret bases had been constructed by refugee engineers using a combination of Zilithian spacefolding technology and human improvisational techniques that produced results no one could have predicted. As they emerged from hyperspace near what appeared to be an empty asteroid field, Marcus still felt a moment of satisfaction at seeing their hidden fortress materialize as the ship's sensors penetrated the holographic camouflage. The base was a testament to what could be accomplished when species that had never worked together before suddenly found themselves fighting for their mutual survival. The transport docked smoothly, and Marcus made his way through corridors that bustled with constant activity. The base housed nearly 50,000 beings now, military personnel, civilian refugees, scientists, engineers, and volunteers from across the galaxy who had decided they wanted to be part of the resistance rather than subjects of the hegemony. Marcus found Empress Viroleth in the main command center, studying holographic displays that showed the current tactical situation across 17 star systems. Her scales had settled into a pattern of deep gold and purple that Marcus had learned to associate with cautious optimism mixed with royal determination. "How did the raid go?" she asked without looking up from the displays. "Better than projected," Marcus reported. "We destroyed their entire supply stockpile for the sector and captured enough intelligence data to keep our analysts busy for weeks. More importantly, we confirmed that their supply lines are becoming increasingly strained."
Viroletha's scales shifted to brighter gold. "Show me."
Marcus activated his personal tactical interface and began highlighting enemy positions and movement patterns. "They're having to commit more and more resources just to maintaining their existing positions. Every base they establish requires significant defensive forces because they can't predict when or where we'll strike next."
"And our casualties?" 3 wounded, none killed. The new assault tactics are working exactly as we hoped."
That was perhaps the most remarkable development of the entire war. Traditional military doctrine assumed that irregular forces would suffer heavy casualties when attacking prepared positions, but Marcus had developed an approach that prioritized information and mobility over direct confrontation. They struck when and where the enemy was weakest, accomplished their objectives quickly, and disappeared before effective retaliation could be organized. Prince Zirith approached from across the command center, his own scales showing the confident purple of a military commander who had finally found his true calling. The former rebel had proven to be remarkably gifted at the kind of unconventional warfare they were fighting, and his knowledge of imperial military protocols had been invaluable in coordinating with regular forces.
"Marcus," he said, "we've received some interesting communications from the Inner Rim. 3 more systems have declared independence from the hegemony in the past week."
"Which systems?"
"Korthax, Volani, and, surprisingly, Drexel Prime."
Marcus raised his eyebrows at the last name.
Drexel Prime had been one of the hegemony's earliest conquests, absorbed so completely that most analysts considered its population fully integrated.
If they were declaring independence after 40 years of hegemony rule, it suggested that the resistance movement was having effects far beyond anything Marcus had dared hope for.
"What kind of support are they requesting?"
"Military advisors, primarily," Prince Zirith replied. "They want to learn our tactics and adapt them to their local conditions." Marcus nodded, already thinking through the logistics of supporting independence movements across dozens of systems simultaneously. "We can spare some personnel, but they'll have to understand that each situation will require custom solutions. What works for us may not work for them."
"Already anticipated," Prince Zirith said with a smile. "I've been developing